And thanks to all of you for inviting me today. It's a real pleasure not only to be presenting on some of my favorite topics, but also just to be in New Brunswick in general. I've been on sabbatical here for the last 10 months and really enjoying it. So yeah, thanks. I look forward to your questions. So today my overall presentation is on a science-based approach to understanding herbicides in forest management for biodiversity. I'll be pulling from some data that I've collected in Oregon over 10 years and some data that I've been working on just in New Brunswick, actually over the last 8 months during my sabbatical. So just a little bit about me. This is what I spend most of my time doing, thinking about wood supply globally and regionally, and how to balance that supply with how to conserve all the other species on the planet. Estimate of 8 million species on the planet, so it's no small challenge to try and do these things. And of course, we have billions of people worldwide that depend on wood for their livelihoods and their existences. So this has been the focus of my career, really, for the last 20 years. I know my tagline says Oregon State University, but I grew up here in New Brunswick, just outside of St. John. I paid for my university by tree planting out on Irving lands and in Ontario. And I just thought you'd appreciate this picture my mom dug up when she heard I was giving this presentation. So I think I planted 4,000 trees in a day, if you can believe it. That was my record. I had some lows as well. So today I'm going to talk about this long-term study we've been doing in Oregon on herbicides and wood production and biodiversity. Then I'm going to talk about forest ecology, just a little primer for those of you that aren't as familiar with New Brunswick's forests. And it'll be a review for the rest of you. And honestly, a little bit of a break from some of the data I'm going to show you in the first one, which might be detailed. And then finally, I'm going to tell you about this research I've been doing the last 10 months on forest management in New Brunswick over the last 35 years and how it's affected our plants and animals. And as part of that management strategy, herbicides have been an important part. So you're going to see the long-term effects of herbicides on animal populations. So yeah, herbicides, wood production, and biodiversity. So it won't be surprising to you that herbicide use is extraordinarily controversial in Oregon as well. It's been all over the newspapers, and these are issues in terms of human health and also in terms of biodiversity conservation. We have a very strong environmental community in Oregon, so there's been a lot of pressure on policymakers. So Triangle Lake is probably one of the most famous areas for this controversy. Lincoln County, which is in western Oregon on the coast, was the first county in the entire United States to ban aerial herbicide spraying. And I'm not talking about banning it just on public land. It was they had a ballot measure to ban it on private land, which was remarkable at the time. That was since overturned by a judge, and now is in front of the courts again. So really, I just want to emphasize herbicide looms large in Oregon. And then recent results showing that biodiversity may also be responding directly to the effects of herbicide. A particular study that shows that Roundup could be causing bee deaths. So that's the context for some of our research. And so over the last, well, it's 11 years now actually, we've been asking this question: how is biodiversity, and that's the variety of all life, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a second, affected by herbicide use in Oregon's forests? So we set up an experiment, and experiments are considered sort of the gold standard in science. Experiments are really the only way you can attribute cause to an action. And this is not a correlative study. And the experiment involved planting clear cuts, which is the standard industrial practice in Oregon, followed by planting, and then completely variable levels of herbicide. And hopefully, can everyone see this okay? So on the top left, you have the control where no herbicide was sprayed. And if you can, remember this color scheme. Green is control. Blue is a light spray, and I'll show you what that means in a second. Just sprayed once, and that's similar to what happens on state lands in Oregon. That orangey yellow color is a moderate spray with 2 applications of herbicide, and that's more similar to what happens on industrial lands. And then finally, we had this treatment called intensive that really nobody does. We nicknamed it the Mordor treatment, and that it was a total of 3 and 4 sprays of herbicide. And the reason we did that was to push the buttons to see if biodiversity responded, and also whether spraying that much herbicide actually increased tree growth rates. So I'm not going to go over this table in detail at all, but it's just to point out the herbicide schedule that should be in your printed materials, and to point out that this study was not designed to determine the effect of a particular active ingredient in herbicides. It was designed to test how the slurry of chemicals used by foresters in Oregon, and really in many industrial forests, affects biodiversity. And so you can see from control with no spray all through intensive, a variety of elements used. And glyphosate was included in the moderate and the intensive. They're quite commonly used operationally in Oregon. And so, of course, we didn't just have one of each of these treatments. It's good science to have many replicates. And you can see here that color scheme again. You can actually tell the treatments. This is a few years after spraying. You can tell the treatments from space, the degree to which they're green, with a control not only surrounded in green, but also coming up green. And we replicated these, we call these study blocks, so all 4 treatments, 8 times across Western Oregon. And what that gives us is strong inference and ability to extrapolate beyond the specific little study boundaries. So prepare you for this. I'm going to give you all of our methods in the next 30 seconds. Okay, so I apologize for the whirlwind, but so we have these treatments, the 4 treatments. You're with me there, I think. And then we measured what we call the direct effects. You know, it's expected that herbicides are going to kill herbaceous plants and shrubs. So we went out and we measured the full diversity to the species level in all of these different plants. Then we had light traps for moths. We had 350 different species. We counted arthropods using sweep nets and pitfall traps. We went out and we put camera traps up for deer and elk, the 2 dominant ungulates in the region. We did pollination surveys, both with blue vein traps and at flowers. And we went out and we counted birds by ear at all of these sites. So it's one of the most extensive field campaigns that I've done in my life. Of course, I didn't collect the data. We had an army of field assistants, and they'd all be rolling their eyes and thinking that I'm describing this so quickly, but it's okay. So in total, we ended up with over 140,000 detections of all these different species, and in total, over 800 taxa. I say taxa because some of the insects weren't identifiable below genus. So now I'm going to show you some plots, and I'm afraid to say that the presentation didn't entirely come through perfectly in the translation, but it was a bit late. But I want you to just if you can, pay attention to this graph. This is just the abundance of woody plants across treatments, okay? And unfortunately, the light treatment is missing for some random reason. But you can see the green, which is the control, and the red, which is the intensive, and the orange, which is the industrial standard. Okay, so as you would expect, herbicides have seriously changed the abundance of woody plants in our system. Not surprising, but an important finding. With herbaceous plants, a similar effect, but less significantly so. Interestingly, for flowers, and again, I'm sorry, the 2 medium treatments aren't showing up. We actually see more flowers, just sheer abundance in the intensive. And I can tell you that's driven entirely by the fact that those flowers are non-native weedy species that moved into the growing space caused by the intensive herbicide spray. Okay, and the results overall are really similar for species richness as well, with big differences in richness for woody and herbaceous species. So again, this wouldn't really surprise anyone. You know, these herbicides are designed to kill these plants. So the question is, and these are the results I just showed you, do these effects propagate up through the food web? When you remove all those plants, do we see changes in pollinators and birds and ungulates? And the answer is that for birds, yes, we see quite strong effects, especially in the first year. For birds in later years, things tended to equalize in terms of abundance and richness. So 5 years out from spraying, the controls are looking a lot more like the treatments. Bees, we actually didn't find a significant difference for abundance, but we did for richness, with more richness in the controls. Arthropods, the same pattern, higher richness in the controls than the treatments, but no difference in abundance. Moss, no significant difference of either. And then finally, deer and elk. Actually, surprisingly, we had just as many detections in our camera traps across these. But I should emphasize that for the plants elk eat, they were depressed in abundance and deer. So overall, 18% fewer species across the 800 we observed. And mainly this was driven by plants, pollinators, which obviously have important ecosystem service effects, and birds. So the next bit, and this is the important bit in terms of balance, how do these intensive forest management practices or herbicides affect tree growth rates? Because we were told when we started this study we'd actually need special dispensation from Salem Capital to allow us to do the experiment, because they thought all of our plantations with no herbicide would fail. So put it in that context and look at this result. There's not that much difference between the green and the red. You see? It's about, and my eyesight is bad, getting old. It's around 20% higher growth rates. That's board feet, by the way, on the x-axis. So it's about 20% increase in growth rate as a result of spraying all of those herbicides. Okay, and these data are timber modeled out to rotation age. And in this case, the assumption is a 40-year rotation age. Okay, if we go to longer rotation ages, so we let trees grow longer, those differences get a bit more pronounced. So if you let trees grow 60 years and cut them, you're going to gain about 30% wood volume. Okay, here, I'm going to show you a picture in a bit. Trees grow a lot slower. And so I'd be fascinated to know. See the same graph for New Brunswick. Of course we need this to be put in the public domain before we can make really good decisions. The last thing I'm going to show you on this topic is economic revenue. And this is something that was new to me. You should know I'm not an economist. I've done economics in university, but I don't have a PhD in economics. So this was a collaboration with a colleague at Oregon State. What we did here was we calculated something called the land expectation value. And this involves something called discounting, which probably some of you are quite familiar with. Okay, but I'm going to walk you through it in clip art, because this is what I do for my students. So here we have the Honorable Ms. Johnson with some money to invest. And she's trying to decide whether she should go out and plant and spray, or whether she should plant and then take the money she would have spent on herbicide and invest it. Okay? Logical thing to try and decide between. And so if you invest that money, your trees don't need to grow quite as quickly to compensate for that discount rate. If you spray, your trees need to grow more quickly because you've got to pay that discounted $200 per hectare 40 years or 50 years or 60 years into the future when you cut those trees down. So the discount rate on that amount, $200 per hectare, turns out to be $2,057 at the 40-year rotation, right? So you're not spending $200, you're spending $2,000, and those trees better grow really quickly, or you're not going to compensate for that $2,000 spent. So the results, and keep in mind this is a fast-growing forest, at a 4% discount rate, sure enough, spraying herbicides pays. And by that I mean if you're only expecting a 4% yield in your investments. Okay, and that's far below what investors expect in Oregon, actually. At 7% discount rate, which is more like what people expect who invest in forestry in Oregon, there's really not that much of a difference. And so herbicides pay to some extent when discounted, but less so. And then if you go all the way up to 10% discount rates, which I do wish, I'm sure all of us wish our investments would pay that well. Of course, herbicides don't pay at all, and you might as well have stayed home and saved your money on the herbicide. So again, this would be something, maybe somebody's already done this in New Brunswick, but I would love to see this full cost benefit analysis done. When you invest that $29 million in herbicides, does it actually pay at rotation age when discounted? Could the money be spent in a more efficient way somewhere else? And again, these are some trees planted in one of my study sites. This is one of my grad students, Hong Kyu Kim. And you can see these are 6-year-old trees. The leader on that tree in the foreground is about 1 meter long. Foresters call it a speed wobble. They grow so quickly, they end up with a bit of a spiral to them. All right, so conclusions: biodiversity often negatively impacted by herbicides, about 80% reduction in species richness. Tree growth rates do improve, but really not as much as expected. We did not need to get a special permit in those controls. And it remains to be seen. They might diverge from what our models predicted. They might do even better than we thought. And really, we need to determine the economics of herbicide. Okay, very quickly now, switch gears, and this is going to be a photo essay. I was just down on the Fundy Coast in my old PhD study area last week and thought I'd take you some pictures to walk through some of these basic ideas. So I'm going to show you two pictures, and permission to ask questions of the members. Is that okay? So I'm going to ask you to determine and tell me what differences you see between these two stands. This one, ready? And the next one. Okay, I'm going to show them to you together. So what are the differences that leap out to you? Well, on the left, we've got a mature red spruce, yellow birch stand. On the right, we've got a spruce plantation near the Fundy Coast. It's okay to say obvious things, yeah.
On the left.
It's greener on the left, yeah, and that's because there's so much shade on the right that it's really not enabling herbaceous plants to grow very well. Anything else that's leaping out at you? Think from an animal's perspective if you can too.
The fauna growth, the ground growth.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and one important thing to consider is the structure. We call it vertical structure in wildlife language. You've got lots of layers on the left, and really it's just sort of dead branches on the right. I didn't get a good picture, but the crowns are quite healthy. But there's not much layering, and layering means more species generally in ecology. Anything else? There's much higher density actually. Volume, we'd have to go out and measure, but numbers of stems, yes, and they've been planted. So someone like me went in there and planted them at 6-foot spacing. And some other ones, and I better move along here. Dead wood is a big one. 20% of biodiversity in a forest is tied up in dead wood. Who would have thought 30 years ago or 40 years ago when we were saying dead wood was just a waste of space? 20% of the biodiversity is locked up there, and you can see a standing snag, second over from the left, a dead wood on the ground, and of course, higher diversity of trees themselves. So the other big difference between plantations in New Brunswick and most places really and naturally regenerated forest has to do with the tree age. So typically in Oregon and in New Brunswick, we don't let trees get much older than 60 years before we harvest them, if things are going well. Some of these native old forests, some of these species can live to be 250, 300 years old. And you can imagine how it's quite different from a wildlife perspective. The other thing I want you to notice in this particular picture is all the green stuff coming up below. What are those? There's moss there, but also red spruce. Okay, these spruce are growing really well, albeit in the shade. They're called shade tolerant, which means they can manage shade for a long time. When the canopy opens up, they're released and they grow. So if I went in there with a saw and cut down a patch opening or a few tree opening, you'd get natural regen. No need for herbicides at all. That's a really important message. So this is quite a standard practice in New Brunswick, although reduced to some extent. A clear cut where I planted all my trees through my tree planting career. It doesn't necessarily need to come back as plantation. A number of our clear cuts are naturally regenerated, and that's what you see here. These are shade intolerant species, and they crowd into the room as soon as you cut. They're very good at competing. And so it's species like red maple and sugar maple, or sorry, red spruce and sugar maple don't compete that well against these species like white birch and pin cherry and raspberry, of course. So there are two trajectories. And this intolerant hardwood trajectory, I'll call it, is what will happen naturally after a clear cut if it's not planted and sprayed. These tree species are often lower value. And it can take up to 150 years to get the original forest starting to regenerate underneath the canopy of these intolerant hardwoods, okay? So the take-home message then is the history in New Brunswick has been one of moving from the mature forest, either mixed or hardwood, toward plantations that tend to be more simple structurally and with only a few species in them, or moving toward intolerant hardwood, which are these species that compete really well and grow quickly. But it's certainly a conversion that we're talking about. Okay, last section. 5 minutes? Oh, no.
Yeah, I mean, I held my hand up, it was
Well,
5.
well, maybe someone will ask me a question about the next bit. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, at this point, unfortunately, I have to turn to the official opposition, and they'll ask you questions, and then we'll go around to each, each political party. All right, thank you for that. Next up, we have Mr. Kuhn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question really is, can you tell us what you were going to tell us about forest management and biodiversity in New Brunswick? And you're welcome to use my 10 minutes.
Thanks, David. So, is this okay with everybody? I think it is, 10 minutes? Okay, so I've already described some of this, so it's going to be even easier. These are data from our remote sensing analysis that show the cumulative amount of clear cutting over time in the maritime provinces as a whole. And then the purple line is the amount of area that's been planted and or pre-commercially thinned. So managed in such a way that it's simplifying the structure of the forest. And then on the right here, we have the map that we derived that shows that clear-cut disturbance and associated plantation. And I apologize, on this particular slide, the purple is very close to the pink, so you can't distinguish them. But the take-home message is that a high proportion of the places we clear-cut are planted. And then remember, if we don't plant them, they tend toward intolerant hardwoods, which are certainly a different sort of forest and likely lower quality habitat for many of these species. So, and this is an extreme view of the conversion that's happened over the last 35 years. You can at least picture how this forest was similar on both sides of the road and now has moved from mixed wood forest to conifer forest. So I did want to justify the interest in birds, and I've already done that briefly, but birds are seen broadly as biodiversity indicators, and there are a number of reasons for that. You know, it goes all the way back to people having canaries in coal mines back at the turn of the century in New Brunswick. And of course, we all know that our understanding of DDT first emerged, at least partly because people started noticing eggshell thinning in birds, and that led to the cessation of DDT in many parts of the world. Birds also have been some of the harbingers of climate change. And so this is a paper by a friend of mine in Nature from the late 90s. And they were the first species really to be shown to extending their range northwards as the climate warmed in the UK. And then I think you've already talked about this, but birds are also insect consumers. And this is a bay-breasted warbler, a photo I took just a couple weeks ago, actually, down near the Fundy Coast. And it's well known to be a budworm specialist. And so the ecosystem services, we call them, provided by birds can be very important. And then finally, and I mentioned this already, we sample them very well. This is a map of the Maritimes, obviously. All the black dots you can see are the Maritimes Breeding Bird Atlas. Okay, and the Breeding Bird Atlas is a mostly volunteer atlas where people span the province counting birds at all those points over a 4-year period. Remarkable effort. And then the orange routes are a separate survey, but they go all the way back to 1960. And people go out every June and drive along those 50-kilometer long roads, and they count birds on either side of them. So it's an amazing data set. We've got nothing similar for lichens. We've got nothing similar for flying squirrels, marten. Deer comes close, right? So that's the reason to focus on birds. And so I want you to think of them as indicators, but also it's the only taxon we can really study well. And so the question that I've been working on these last 8 months are, how are bird populations affected by intensification of management in New Brunswick? So that pink image I showed you of the map with that substantial footprint, how is that affecting bird populations? And just really briefly, a little bit of technical stuff here. It's fun, so stick with me. We have 7 remote sensing bands that we get from Landsat. And the neat thing about Landsat, it's a satellite that's 750 kilometers above the Earth. It takes photos every couple months. And those go all the way back to 1985. So what we did was we built statistical models that matched bird locations to those remote sensing bands. And the models performed really well. And so it enabled us to backcast all the way to 1985 and then quantify how habitats changed. And so this is my good news graph is this one. Forest amount in New Brunswick has not changed much. And this, if this was Oregon, people would be pretty thrilled, you know, but we're urbanizing and people are sprawling out all over the place. In New Brunswick, not much area has been lost in forest. So that's a real win. Now I'm going to show you how bird habitats changed. This is a Blackburnian warbler. It's kind of the quintessential old forest species in New Brunswick, and probably none of you have seen it. Well, how many have seen it? Can I see a show of hands? Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. It nests 30 meters up in red spruce, and really not many people know much about it, but it's not uncommon at all. And so what I'm going to show you here, hopefully if it works, is a video. Blue is habitat, and yellow is non-habitat. Can I show it to you again? No, I can't. But this gives you the bookends. 1985, blue is habitat, yellow is non, and 2020. And so what you should notice from this figure, if you've got good eyes, unlike me, is that the protected areas we established quite intelligently are now standing out in 2020 as the remaining Blackburnian habitat. And then there are some swaths still left. That's some good news. I do want to emphasize that it's not, you don't need strict protection either to maintain the species or to maintain the mixed forest it depends on. You know, you could do intelligent silviculture that doesn't require herbicides. So we did this for all 54 species. This is another one, golden crowned kinglet, and you can see the change from blue to blue in 1985 to 2020. And this is sort of the take-home message figure. The species are all listed. I don't expect you to read them from top to bottom in order of how much habitat they've lost over time. And you can see that the majority of species have gone from yellow to red or green to red, which means habitat loss. And again, this is not a selected or biased suite of species. This is just a naive top 54 species of birds that rely on forests in New Brunswick. And so this is the sort of pattern we're seeing for habitat. This is for the 7 most declining species. So about a 33 to 40% decline in habitat for these species since 1985. So the question you'd be asking if you've got a science bent is, all right, we modeled habitat change, but who's to say that means bird population change? It could well be these birds are packing in or going elsewhere. And so we also modeled how populations have changed over time. And these are the 8 worst. You know, I'm giving you the bad news. But for some of these species, we're seeing declines of up to 80% over time. And not all of that is driven by these changes in forest structure, but a high proportion of it is for some of these species. All right, so we also, because we know the territory sides of all these birds and we know how much habitat has been lost, we can estimate how many individual birds have likely been lost over the period of time from 85 to 2020. So again, we think these declines, and we have evidence that it's happening as a function of conversion from mature, mixed, and hardwood and softwood forests to plantations and intolerant hardwood. And I guess the question I'd throw out to you is, you know, if this is happening for birds, and, you know, honestly, they can move around pretty well. They are more generalist than a number of other species. And so we just don't know what's happening to more specialized species like flying squirrel or American martin and others. This map is of how much mixed wood forest has changed over time. I apologize to those of you who are red-green colorblind. I should have thought of that. But the red is mixed wood forest that's been lost. The green is mixed wood forest that's being maintained. And again, the reserve network's working well, and some landowners are working well. And the blue is gain. You know, so we are gaining some of this mixed wood, but it's certainly not, the blue does not balance the red. All right, so the conclusions are intensive forest management's increasing plantation and clear-cut area, and that's not regenerating at the same rate as it's being harvested. This is driving habitat loss for 54 most common bird species, and then habitat losses associated with population declines. So, you know, the concluding questions then are, what should be the future of New Brunswick forests? do we need to trade biodiversity for wooden jobs? And I'm optimistic. I don't think that we do. I think we can continue to produce wood. It just takes intelligent silviculture and intelligent planning, and we can slow or stop the bird declines and the habitat loss. So I've given you my recommendations, so I won't spend more time on that. I'd be really happy to hear more questions, but thank you all for being good enough to listen to that last 10 minutes. Appreciate it.